Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday Talks with FEO. My name is Debbie Mann. I'm with Festivals and Events Ontario. I am so excited about our guest today. We have Helen Chimirri-Russell from the Region of Waterloo, and we have Richard Evans from EMC Arts. And I'm so excited that they're joining us. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we start. This is being recorded, so just so that you know that it's being recorded. Be nice. And if you have any questions, I just want you to feel free to either one, enter it into the chat room, and I'll ask Helen and Richard the questions. B, you can raise your hand under the reactions and I will ask you and you can unmute yourself. Or if I don't see you, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. It's, as you know, you've been here before. We just want to have some fun. And it's a real interesting conversation. So I'm very excited about this. So let's get going. Hi, again, Helen and Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited about this conversation. So, just want to introduce yourself real quickly.
Sure, I'll start. I'm Helen Chimirri-Russell. I'm the Director of Cultural Services with the Region of Waterloo. So I oversee museums and libraries and public art and cultural relationships with the region. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today to talk about what I think is going to be something really interesting. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Helen, for joining us. Richard.
Thanks, Helen and Debbie. And I'm Richard Evans. I'm the co-founder and now the President Emeritus. I don't know what I did to earn that title, but of EMC Arts. We're a service organization serving the arts sector and helping arts organizations to innovate and adapt to address the changing conditions in which we all are having to operate these days. We started about 15 years ago. We have programs all over North America. We're based in the United States, but we've also worked in Calgary, in Edmonton, in Vancouver. We have a big program right now in Toronto. And I'm about to start a new program with Helen and the department in Kitchener-Waterloo. So our work is all about helping arts organizations to adapt in new and original ways to meet the changing and challenging conditions that they face.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So I have to lead us off here. So what do you think the future is going to look like post-COVID? And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on board, because you're creative minds and sort of stepping outside the box. And I just want to, ask you what you think the future may look like, or how we need to be in order to plan for the future post-COVID.
I'll kick that one off. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we're here today. And I see Alan smiling brightly at the question of, right? And so this is why Richard and I have started working together again. We've been having various conversations, but I really tried to pull us back together, because as we've gone through COVID and gone through the pandemic and the sheer number of changes, you certainly got to that point where you're like, wait a second, because it was a lot of adapting all along, right? New regulations, new changes, new possibilities, new having to stop, right? It was this constant having to adapt. And I think then there was that sense of the horizon, and there was always this desire to go back to the way things were, because then we could just pick up where we left off. But you're getting to that sense of the world has changed, not just, the regulations that were imposed through COVID, but the entire world has changed. The way that we deliver our services as a municipality, how we've had to wake up to how we make services equitable rather than just equal. How does our audience respond? You can't just open the door back up again, which is what we did in June. Said, okay, we're open again. And nobody came back to the museums. And you're like, oh, gee, the world has changed. So the work that Richard and I did back in Alberta, and the work that I'm looking to do as we move forward, is that how do we build the adaptive capacity of the organizations within the Region of Waterloo, but also us as municipal funders and municipal supporters to support the sector to continue to adapt to the fact that we kind of don't know what the future is going to be like. It probably isn't going to look like it did before. So, Richard, I'd like to expand kind of from there.
Yeah, I'd add, Helen, that it seems to me one of the things in a way the pandemic has amplified or revealed are actually all the other things which were already changing. over the last 10 to 15 years. You refer to some of them, the changing ways that people want to engage with the arts, the much more inclusive, democratic approach we know our sector has to take if it's going to go on being really significant to the lives of our communities. And as we think about the time that's coming up, as we in some ways come out of the pandemic, I think we need to remember that those changing conditions are continuing. Dee Hock, who is the founder of the Visa organization, has famously said that we live now in a VUCA world. He means by that it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think these are the conditions we face anyway, and we're going to return to those. So one way I like to sum that up, and I'm going to share my screen and show a slide of this, which may illustrate the point. And I hope in a moment everyone can see this slide up on the screen. Please let me know in the chat box if you simply can't see it, but I'm seeing a nod. I was brought up, and I think arts organizations throughout North America were fundamentally brought up to think that the future could be achieved in this kind of manner, right? We wanted to have a big vision and goals for the future, and we create a plan to get there. And therefore, through various different kinds of inputs and activities, we would move in this kind of step-like and reasonably rational way towards the outcomes we wanted and the impacts we hope to achieve. This is kind of a theory of change. You know, it's a classic way of thinking about the future that I know I was brought up to feel deeply was the way that organizations should think about themselves. And I think what has happened in the last 18 months, but even more so over the last 10 years, is that we've come to realize that the way forward to the future turns out to be rather more like this these days. And that's what you're saying, I think, that we can no longer predict any kind of rational or linear trajectory toward the future. And so planning and associated techniques of that kind, which I used to be a consultant in for a long time, are of very limited use to us as we deal with this complex, ambiguous world. We need to learn, I think, different techniques, different approaches that allow us to navigate complexity and discover the way forward toward our vision in new ways. And right now, I think, Helen, I don't know if you're finding the same thing, but in all our work across the country, we're finding an inevitable fatigue, and that everyone's come through. In the short term, everyone has been highly adaptive, but I want to stress that really truly adapting in the long term is being not so much being able to duck and weave and just keep going despite what's going on, but to be proactive, ahead of the curve, and planning the future with an experimental mindset. And I think that's what's going to be called upon, not to lapse back towards the hope that business as usual will return, but to actually go on building our capacity to adapt as all the new challenges are thrown at us and as the world continues to change so fast. I think that's what we're called upon to do. And that means reserving a bit of energy amongst all that fatigue to actually find the space to do this kind of adaptive work.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you and I are trying to work together to do is giving our sector the tools to be able to adapt and work within this environment. So rather than trying to go back to what we had before, which was that beautiful step model of simple trajectory, but recognizing that our world looks like this and will continue to look like this. It's not just the chaotic world of the pandemic, but as we emerge from it, we'll constantly have to adapt to change. And we need a new set of tools and a new set of skills to be able to allow us to thrive in that environment.
We were looking at this. We were looking at this slide just before we opened up, and I think, Debbie, you were saying, "Oh, it's just life, isn't it?" You know, and I think I've used this in many contexts, and everyone would say something similar. But it's interesting that we haven't applied the insights that come from approaching our lives to the way we approach our organizations, and we've tried to go back to that more rational approach. But whoever had a day that turned out as they thought it would?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So why the shift? Why do you think that there is a need for the shift in these capacities in the arts and the festival and event world? Why is that important right now?
I would begin that one by saying that I do think that what I find is that our arts organizations, and indeed a lot of other nonprofits across the region, have been set up to be very reliable and consistent in the way they approach the future. and they've got great systems, magnificent skills in technical departments to kind of keep them on the railroad toward the future. And it is those very strengths which are now turning out in many cases to be liabilities, because in order to deal with the picture we're looking at, you've got to have a different set of capacities than those that keep you on that narrow railroad, what I call stabilizing capacities, if you will. And we spent a lot of time over the last 60 years in this field, I think, encouraging organizations and supporting organizations to improve their technical capacities to keep on doing what they've always done in the past. And so there's a lot of sort of unlearning to be done. And the adaptive capacities, which I think are those organizational muscles, if you like, that enable us not just to do something differently. We can all do that for a short time, but to keep on doing things differently and not snap back to the way we used to do things, mean that the underlying muscles in our organizations need to be really developed around continuously adapting. So I think it's time for us to strengthen and flex those muscles. I'm not saying that our organizations don't have the ability to do this, but this is the time to really strengthen those muscles. And my experience is that the most adaptive organizations I've worked with know that the journey is never done. You can always continue to strengthen how you adapt, because the challenges you meet, as Helen was saying, are unpredictable.
Mm-hmm. And how uncomfortable is that? Like having to shift. I mean, Helen, you're laughing, you've been there, but, and it's a perpetual state of uncomfortableness, isn't it? For a while anyways, until you get comfortable with the uncomfortable.
And I think part of that is going back to the first slide and then looking at the second slide, is we keep trying to convince ourselves that the first slide is the reality. And as Richard said, and as you said right at the beginning, we know that this is the reality, but we've put a lot of effort and a lot of structures in place to try to make the world like that first slide. And part of the work that Richard's program works on is trying to uncover the assumptions and this constant assumption that that's the way that the world is, and that planning can get us places, and certain things, structures that we've put in place are the right things to do. And it is very uncomfortable to look at your assumptions and realize that they're not actually quite what you thought they were, because we've all together built up these ideas about the way the world is and the way that the world should be and the way that the structure should support us and the way that things fit together and the way that we relate to audiences. And when you really spend the time to look at them, some of the assumptions are 100% correct, yes, and some of them aren't. And it makes you feel really weird to actually question some of the things that you thought were just the way the world was.
But I think it can also be quite releasing, Helen. I think it takes courage and stamina, as you say, to look at this picture and not just want to push it away and say, we can't live in a world like that, because actually we can learn to navigate it if we have the right muscles. It's just that they're so underdeveloped in a way that we don't feel equipped to do that. I am reminded of the great researcher into organizational change, Clayton Christensen, who wrote a famous book called The Innovator's Dilemma, and a few others. And he was trying to investigate the question, why is it that well-managed companies fail? And his answer was very interesting after years of research. He said, because they're well-managed. I think it's a very provocative conclusion, because what he really means is that if you always go on sticking to the solid management principles, the best practices that have grown up in your field or that you've learned from the elders in the field, the things that you've found to work over the years, if you keep your blinders on and only stick to those approaches, you will miss the signs of all the new things that are springing up and the upstarts that will take over, and you'll find it's too late to change. And this is why so many companies fail to see the need for change until it's too late. And when you are struggling on a downhill slope for a while, it's actually the hardest possible place to change from. So I encourage all nonprofits in the arts and in other fields to really think about what are the assets we can build on. Where are things still going well, or where we see potential before we get to a place where everything's going badly, and begin to think about change at that time. That is hard, because a lot of people around you will want to say, well, hell, it's not broken right now, so why should we fix it? But we stand on the brink of things being, in some senses, very broken. And so although we may be tipping over, I think we're not at a point where we're all on a downhill slope. I think we have a real chance to move in new directions and build these adaptive capacities. I'll just give everyone a sight of some of those adaptive capacities. I think I can make them come up on the screen if I'm really lucky. In all the work we've been doing, we found there are at least 8 of these. I hope you can see those on the screen. These are what I'm calling ways of doing things in organizations, or organizational muscles, that will specifically support your organization, not only doing new things, but sustaining new directions and an experimental mindset so that you can navigate complexity and thrive in the future. And each of these might be contrasted with a stabilizing capacity that's about keeping on doing things the way you always have. So for instance, if you don't question those assumptions early on, you will in fact keep on doing things in the same way. If you don't, number 4, if you don't bring multiple perspectives together as you think about what you might do, if you rely on the same small circle of experts to inform your thinking, you will basically keep going in roughly the same direction. And each one of these challenges some aspect of how I think we were brought up to think our organizations should behave. I just want to draw attention to number 3. I think this is a very important part of adaptive work, bringing teams together across the kind of silos that tend to exist in organizations. Even if it's a very small organization that you're part of, people have very distinct roles and they're taught to do their job within that role. And yet actually it's getting out of that job description, if you like, and giving people's creativity more room to flower. It's bringing people in from outside the organization whose views you may not be used to hearing, that will really shake things up in a positive way and bring new ideas to the table that you couldn't possibly otherwise have conceived of. Number 5, we're traditionally used to the idea that we should move as rapidly as possible to consensus around one idea, one big strategy, one next step. The beauty of adaptive work is you can actually charter multiple ways forward because you don't know which is going to work. You've got to experiment with multiple small steps toward the future, learn rapidly, and then coalesce them into an emerging strategy. So people can actually go off and try their own ideas. And I'll mention number 8 just very quickly because it's in some ways the hardest, which is when nonprofits get going and they accumulate programs and funding, it's one of the reasons they keep on doing everything as they always had, even if they have a feeling that it's not going as well as it used to. So giving things up regularly in order to shift your human and financial resources towards new and adaptive work is one of the things we find to be profoundly important. So I encourage everyone to think about how could we have these kinds of approaches be really strong in our organization. Not every day. We want to build them so that when we recognize that the situation is volatile and adaptive, we can bring those muscles to the fore.
Excuse me. I know I'm one of those people that get stuck in this is the way we always did things. And there's a part of me that wants to go and venture out and do something new at the same time. So I'm caught between the two, but I love this slide. It is, I think people in organizations, especially bigger organizations, will have that challenge. You've got those with the tried and true belief system, and then you've got the risk takers who are wanting to venture out. And it's a fine balance, I would say.
Yeah,
I think
go ahead.
I was going to add to Debbie's comment that I think we're often saying to organizations in relation to number 8, put something on hold while you try these new approaches to this big challenge you've got. And that's hard to do. But now we've all put an awful lot of things on hold. And in a way, and I'm not trying to simplify this, that opens up the space to say, okay, let's take some of the resources we still have and some of the support we can call upon to fill that space with adventurous ways to think about the future that are new. So I think there is that opportunity. Helen.
I was just going to comment on how exhausting it was through the pandemic, that everything was unknown, and that comfort of doing things that you've always done, and the fact that you don't really have to think about it. You just know how to do it. You know how to put it together. And then all of a sudden, particularly with, I mean, festivals were the same, museums, right? That we couldn't operate, we couldn't open our doors in their traditional way. So what do we do instead? And so there was nothing was stable, nothing was comfortable, everything was up in the air and being rethought. But there was a certain amount of freedom to that, that we could put things on hold because we had to. We couldn't have our traditional Christmas thing where we had 500 people walking through our historic village. It just couldn't happen. But even recently, all of a sudden, we didn't have the resource to write our normal monthly newsletter. And so we just didn't do it. And guess what? Nothing bad happened. And it was a real eye-opener when all of a sudden you're like, oh, people aren't actually sitting there at their inboxes waiting for this newsletter to come out. That's not what's happening. And it allowed us to let go of a lot of that assumption and allowed us to free up that capacity, which had to do with producing the newsletter, to go and do something else in the moment, engaging social media posting, which had a lot of feedback in a way that that newsletter didn't. And so strangely freeing, strangely terrifying, but a kind of that wonderful aha moment of, oh, these things can work if you give them a chance.
Yes, I think I see that a lot. And at the same time, Helen, I would say I see a curious combination of what that people are experiencing, of a kind of paralysis that can also come with that. We may get overwhelmed by the sense of chaos everywhere, or at least, I think even now. And now we're trying to rehire staff, perhaps, and we're finding that people aren't available. There's a massive problem, I think, about qualified people still staying in our field. So there's this sense of paralysis, at the same time, a sense of kind of manic activity as we try to think about what do we know, what can we still do, and how do we do it? So I think one of the dangers, or one of the things that we find organizations do well to avoid, is kind of lumping all the challenges they're facing in this very, very difficult time into one kind of big cloud of unknowing, and say everything is really chaotic, or we can only go back to business as usual, or let's rely on experts, they'll tell us how to get out of this. And I think none of those kinds of responses, although they're all understandable, is sufficient to the situation. And what I'd like to do is say just a little bit, this is my kind of main thing today, I suppose, about what kind of challenges we find organizations tend to face. And I think we're not terribly good in the nonprofit sector and in the arts at what you might call situational analysis and really understanding the different kinds of challenges. So I'm going to very quickly introduce a simple decision-making framework, which we found that organizations all over the country, in Canada and in the United States, have found really valuable. And it forms a key piece of our work. And some of you may well know this already from other sources. But essentially, the notion here is that there are different contexts within which challenges to organizations arise. There are clear contexts, there are complicated ones, complex ones, and chaotic ones. And there's also a kind of sense of disorder sometimes, where we don't know even where to place this kind of challenge. So an example of a clear challenge, I think, would be baking a chocolate chip cookie. We can all go home and get the recipe and get the right ingredients, and we can pretty reliably produce one. And that's a pretty good guarantee we can do it in the future. A complicated challenge might be selling a house. You could do it on your own, but you probably do well to bring in those experts who know how to market it, how to handle the finances and the legal stuff to get it done. The classic example, I think, of a complex challenge, which I must say, I think are the kinds of challenges that our organizations are more and more facing in this world, would be parenting. And those of us who've tried that extraordinary journey know that, what works for one kid doesn't work for another. What worked last week doesn't work next week. The initial conditions have an enormous influence on what the outcome is. And half the time, we don't even know what the problem is. So these are the classic conditions of complexity: unpredictable, cause and effect do not have any simple relationship. And then a chaotic challenge would be one where there really is no relationship between cause and effect, like a sudden weather storm. And we just have to do triage. We just have to stabilize the system enough to find out where we are. Well, distinguishing between our challenges in these ways is really important, because we must respond in very different ways, I think, according to what kind of challenge we're facing. This was all put together nearly 20 years ago now by an extraordinary guy called Dave Snowden into what's called the Caneven Framework. And it's essentially a framework to help leaders in any kind of organization understand the different challenges they face. You'll see the same kind of contextual domains in this picture, the different relationships between cause and effect, and a little bit about what you do to respond. And it's the responses that really matter, and what I hope people may take away from this, because the point is to do careful analysis of, is this a complicated challenge, and we really should bring in an expert, get some technical assistance, and sort of improve our strategies around good practice. Is it clear enough that we just know there's a best practice we should adopt? Is it complex enough that we need to look for a new and an emergent practice? Or is it chaotic enough that we have to stabilize things? What Snowden is saying is that think about the ways you respond. If it's clear, align with solutions which are out there, reinforce central authority, etc. With complicated challenges, call in experts in your field, improve what you're currently doing, and focus on planning and outcomes. But notice how different it is in the complex domain. You have to let go of those assumptions you were speaking of the ways that you see things or what success might look like. Diverge from what you've done, not improve it, in order to discover the next practices for your organization. Bring in expertise from other fields, not within the field. Distribute leadership, probe and experiment, and focus not on specific outcomes, but on a direction of travel. This is a very different methodology. And of course, the point of the work we're trying to do is to turn these notions of complexity or clarity into a methodology for the future. If you're facing a chaotic challenge, you have to act immediately, create novel practices, and privilege intuition over logic. This, by the way, is the kind of context in which artists are so wonderful, because they live there where most of us want to live in the complicated, and have things be roughly rational. So I do think that, first of all, recognizing the different kinds of challenges that you're facing as an organization and not lumping them into any one of these 4 or 5 different domains is the first step towards identifying the complex challenges that require that you adapt. Because, of course, not every challenge requires that of you. And that's where the energy needs to be placed, I think. You can handle the best practices and returning to business as usual aspects that are indeed going to keep going. My contention would be that coming out of the pandemic and responding to those deeper challenges and changes in the operating environment over the last decade or more, it's the complex challenges that we tend to postpone because they're more difficult to deal with, but which only get worse if we don't attack them early on. And I think that's what we're called to do over the next few years.
And I think part of that as well is that we've got good practices in place for our clear problems and our complicated problems. And it's really tempting to take those tools that we know have worked on many of those issues and take them over into the complex and try to tackle those problems that are emergent and constantly changing. The relationship between cause and effect aren't really the same, and try to take those tools that we've used in the past and apply them to that new challenge, and they just don't work in the same way.
That's dead right. I think the worst thing you can do, Helen, if you decided that the challenge is complex, is try and create a strategic plan to deal with it. That is just not going to help you, partly because you're predicting the future in a context in which the future is frankly unpredictable. And that doesn't mean to say, I think, that you've got to wander around in the dark instead, which I think is what sometimes people think. You can have a methodology, you can experiment, you can probe and learn your way into the future without throwing a lot of money at an untested idea, which I think, again, is what some people think that innovating is. We disagree entirely. It's about small experiments with radical intent, a phrase we use a lot in our work, as you know, Helen, and building on those experiments by learning rapidly, reforming and reshaping them until gradually the emergent strategy that's going to work for you becomes apparent over time. That doesn't mean you spend a lot of money or time initially, but it does mean you get into action and try out multiple ideas about how you might move forward. And you start to find out what's going to work. It's a perfectly sensible methodology. It's not one we've really applied to our field, I think.
And I think that's...
Do you have any examples of those? Because like when I'm looking at this, stories I hear from our industry are, a tornado coming through at a music festival and a stage collapsing. And, And that spawned like more emergency work, emergency planning work, and event, risk management planning. But it didn't happen. We didn't know we had to really, or people didn't pay attention. I think they knew, but they didn't pay attention until it actually happened somewhere, and the overall chaos of it. What have you experienced in your world?
Well, I think you point out something very important, Debbie. Sometimes there's a catastrophic event, which would be chaotic, right? We had a theatre company in Edmonton in one of our programs whose venue burned down about a week before the season was about to open. There's no question this was a chaotic situation. They had to do some triage. And what we often do, I think, once we've done that, once we somehow managed to work with other theatre companies who in that case were tremendously supportive. They found another venue. They got props and costumes from other people. They got new lights. And within a couple of weeks, they were able to open the season. But the danger, I think, is that we snap back to the complicated and just then deal with how do we just keep going and miss the fact that the chaotic thing has revealed some complex challenges. This theatre company had to actually address the challenge of who are we? Who are we going to be now? We no longer have a venue. Should we have a new venue? Should we hire somewhere else? Should we build a building? Or should we think about not being in a venue? So you mustn't miss those complex challenges that often I think a chaotic event can actually reveal. And we must stay in this place of complexity. We've seen lots of organizations that have recognized that the complex challenges are ones that really do require of them that they let their minds open up to new possibilities. I mean, I worked a lot with orchestras who have often got very fixed ideas about how you do things. For instance, how you price the hall. We have these 4 prices from very high to quite low. And surely that's the way you do things. No, we couldn't possibly do one price for everybody. We couldn't possibly allow people in for nothing below a certain income level. We couldn't possibly take out the seating. We couldn't possibly ask the audience what they might like to see programmed. I mean, there are lots of things about the culture of orchestras which are questionable, and the questioning can be very productive in helping them get to a place where some extraordinary things can happen that they would normally simply bypass, I think.
Wonderful, thanks for that. So, why do we need to question our long-held assumptions on this journey?
Yeah, Helen said quite a lot about that, and I think that's absolutely right. And I've tried to stress the idea that if you're in your mind still holding on to some vision of future success that's based upon the way you used to do things, even those things, of course, which used to be successful, when conditions change, you can be pretty certain they're not actually going to deliver for you. It's part of the nature of assumptions, I think, to go down into the bedrock of our organizations and become like unconsciously accepted by everybody who joins the organization. The great researcher in organizational culture, Edgar Schein, has put this, I think, very well. He says that assumptions evolve as repeated successful solutions to problems, right? We try this, we try that, we try pricing the house in different ways, we try different repertoire, we try reaching out to our patrons in different ways. And over time, we find out what works. And so that becomes an assumption about how we should do things that we pass on to everybody in the organization, so that what was once a kind of questionable hypothesis about what we should do becomes a reality for us that everyone takes for granted, right? So the thing is that these assumptions about how we do things, how we get impacts, how we communicate, go down, as I say, into kind of the subconscious and live well beyond their sell-by dates. And even though the evidence may be out there, Debbie, that this one is no longer reliable as a predictor of success, we hang on to it because of the cognitive stability that it gives, and because our job description fits in with a set of assumptions that have been useful in the past. But the big thing is, Schein goes on to say, in order to innovate, we have to resurrect, examine, and break the frame created by our old assumptions. And that's a really tough statement, I think, and quite strong language. And we find that our work with organizations always starts with this piece of work. If you don't step back and deeply question the assumptions that lie behind this challenge becoming so complex for you, you will probably come up with solutions that will tend back toward business as usual within 6 months. And it's not going to work. So you've really got to let go of those assumptions to at least give yourself the space to do thought experiments that you can then consider through small experiments. To me, it's freeing the mind in that way, thinking laterally and getting out of the kind of groove of your habits of mind that is the beginning of an adaptive journey, I think.
Do you have any examples of that, like of a shift? Helen, you've been doing this. So like in Calgary or Richard, you around the world, what examples do you have of that? I mean, I'm doing a course right now where it's changing the thought process about dogs. And not the dog's thought process, but our belief, of, who dogs are and training and behavior modification. So and it's a hard shift for those experts out there who are, down a lane.
I think it is a hard shift, Debbie, but one of the things I think that can really help us is this move from the kind of thought experiment of saying, what if we let go of that assumption? What if we adopt a different mindset? My view would be, you won't frighten everyone off if you start with small experiments. One example was an international children's festival in Alberta that had been very successful for years, but really just invited people to come to the grounds and to the buildings where they held it, to watch, to be traditional audiences with their families at lots of different acts that they brought together from all around the world. And they were part of the city's department structure, but a bit isolated. And they began to realize, as they thought about the challenge of how can we have the community more deeply involved in the festival, that they needed to find ways for participation of that kind to take place. They needed also to think of the other departments of the city as their colleagues, not as their adversaries. So they began to talk to a lot of people, and they began to approach their audiences in advance of the festival in new ways. One of the ways they did this was by going to their entire email list and inviting parents and their kids before the festival to make a little butterfly. And they said, whatever butterflies you send in, we will display them in the festival headquarters. And this was just a small experiment to test whether they could get people to respond to a more participatory invitation. They cleared a notice board in their offices in the library there, expecting maybe to get a few hundred butterflies. And they had to close down the experiment when they reached 50,000 butterflies. And the entire premises and their venues were completely covered in paper butterflies made by kids from all over the region. And it became, of course, a massive thing locally. Everybody came to the festival just to see the butterflies. And they began to realize, it had a huge effect on the festival. They began to realize that actually this invitation, if crafted well in many different ways, could engage the community in radically new ways. And they've adopted all sorts of new ways and frankly transformed the festival from that small experiment that they called, of course, the butterfly effect.
And I think the other piece of that as well was how they engaged the staff. So they'd seen themselves as operating within their traditional structure, within a silo, but then all of a sudden opening it up and recognizing the meaning of this festival to all of the municipal employees and their willingness and interest and enthusiasm in being volunteers, helping out, creating this as a success. So rather than being, I don't know, whatever, I'm the director of finance, but all of a sudden as the director of finance, being able to be part of the festival, not as a paid employee of the municipality, but as a volunteer of the community, and realizing the extent to which this festival meant something to people on a very visceral level, and creating space for that to be able to happen, re-engage the community in an entirely new way, and taking it away from it's our responsibility to bring this festival to the people, to engaging the community in a new way so that it was a more collaborative approach and allowing people to feel a sense of ownership of it. So that small experiment with radical intent then had ripple effects into how they engaged the community and how they used the resources of the community to be able to deliver the festival itself.
Yeah, yeah.
Exciting. That's like, I can only imagine, you know, kids wanting to go to see if their butterflies displayed, right? It's,
Yeah.
Richard, do you have a picture of it?
Oh, I don't have it with me today, but
Dave has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like what I'm hearing and seeing here. And I'm just wondering, I kind of use a 4-word strategy when you're planning events and stuff. And I'm just wondering how, with what you're presenting here, and the one I use is analyze, strategize, execute, and celebrate. And what I find with creative teams and volunteers and stuff is people getting stuck in those first 2 modules of the analyzing and strategizing, forgetting that the project's coming up. And how do you move people along through those processes without it seem like you're trying to kill innovation and strategy? But in the life of an event or a program, you naturally move through those stages. And you know, you sometimes get to the execution stage where you haven't really come up with clear strategies on how you're going to execute events because you've spent so much time analyzing them and talking about different things you can do. And then that being said, is after your event and things didn't work out quite like you think, is everybody goes right to that negative mindset of what did we do wrong, instead of analyzing and celebrating what really worked right. And, you know, if you have multiple teams executing different events, how do you bring all of those things that worked right into your strategies on other teams and without seeming like you're killing creativity? Or
Yeah, complicated question, but I do agree with you that, you know, we can spend too much time in the complicated zone analyzing and strategizing to try and find the right way to do things. And I think it's therefore important, Dave, that we go right back to that Caneven Framework and start by recognizing what are the aspects of what we're trying to put on here that merit some adjustment and then rapid implementation of a plan. And what are those aspects of what we're trying to do that do justify us stepping back and reflecting? I'm going to use that term instead of just analyze, but because there's a lot of analysis, but it's really reflection and slowing down a bit on that side to say, what can we do here that could be different? Which gives people the space for more creativity and to think differently and to experiment. So what we often do with organizations is just ask them to think about what are your big goals at the moment for what we're going to do, what we're going to put on. And they write them on Post-its, and then we put up that picture with those different domains and say, okay, let's start moving the Post-its around and locate them until we all agree what belongs where. And even that exercise can help organizations to see the difference between the kind of goals that they can achieve by improving their strategies and all that stuff, and which ones require that they stand back and think a little bit more deeply and a bit more creatively about how they're going to get there. So I think you can begin in that way. And then I think if you can charter some kind of cross-functional team or bring in some voices from the outside as well for those areas where you need to do things differently, actually what happens is you get tremendous liveliness and people want to move forward. The danger, I think, is of getting stuck too long in thinking about it, which is why we say that these small experiments are actually action research. You get out there and you do something fairly soon, not before you've questioned all those assumptions that we were talking about, but nonetheless, you try stuff. So if the core of one's festival activities is actually stuff you know you want to repeat and you've got it down pretty well, you should do that. But you should also, in advance, really reflect as a team on where are the areas where we probably need to rethink for a bit. Maybe not just the areas where we're not doing so well. Maybe some of those areas where we recognize the world is changing and we need to come up with a new approach here. And give yourself the space in relation to those, which may be only 2 or 3 challenges out of all the goals you've got to achieve, and have a very different methodology, a very different team. And give people the opportunity, as Helen was saying, to step out of their job description to have a different kind of role in making that happen. I think that motivates people and stops them getting stuck.
I think going back to what Richard was saying, that whole idea about small experiments with radical intent forces you to act. You have to do something in order to move things forward. But as I was trying this with my staff throughout the pandemic, it was really interesting to see the challenge between ensuring that your small experiment has radical intent. You're not just doing something for the sake of doing it, but there's a purposeful thing that you're testing and trying out and you're wanting to get there. And that's why we're moving quickly, is because we want to find that thing out. And the other challenge, which blew my mind, was people's ability to keep things small. And there's that tendency to sort of workshop, and then all of a sudden our experiment is cardboard box size or maybe even larger. And trying to keep things small and purposeful was a real challenge. But that excitement of wondering about something and doing something little to test it out certainly breaks you out of that over-analysis piece, that the doing is part of the discovery and part of the thinking.
Yes, that's right.
So
That's right.
so Dave, did that answer your question? I'm sure it answered it for me, that's for sure. And I'm just curious, like, how is all of this going to impact the Waterloo region, Helen? Like, you're working with Richard again. So I'm really curious as to what that means for you.
Sure, I'll talk on two levels. And the first one I'll talk on is understanding, particularly going back to that very first slide that we looked at with that nice little picture of the steps, that we as a municipality have a funding arrangement with many organizations. And we ask them to draw us that nice little thing and tell us what they're going to do. And for us to be able to create space for them to report back and say, it didn't look like that, but it looked like this over here, is one of those really big pieces that we're trying to figure out. How do we create space for people to be able to change? That we're not holding them to something that's very concrete through our funding agreements, because those are there fundamentally to help and support the organizations. And if we don't allow them space to be able to adapt and change, we're just crippling them. So that's one of the big things that we're trying to think through, is how do we create space for that adaptive capacity to take place successfully without us crushing them back to where they were supposed to be in the first place. The other part of the program itself is building a, can I use the word cohort, Richard?
Yes.
So you have not only organizations who are given the opportunity to think through within their own organization how they're going to do things differently and tackle their complex challenges, but rather also how do we build a community of organizations who can continue to do this together and build to support each other through the process. Richard, you want to add to that?
I just add about that particular aspect of the Building Adaptive Capacity program that we'll be launching with you in the new year, is that we have indeed found that sharing across a cohort of organizations through teams that are involved, including board members, artistic and executive leadership and other staff members and so on, and artists, is tremendously important. We've heard it called for trustees the best professional development in the nonprofit sector we ever had. And they begin to realize, first of all, they're all in it together, that although they're individual organizations, the kinds of challenges that they're facing have equal levels of complexity, and they can support each other a lot. They're also great external voices. You want external voices to come up with views on how you might address this challenge, because they're not acculturated to your organization in the same way. So I think all those things are important. But I think it's fair to say, Helen, that the program we're starting off with you is just the beginning. I think the department is looking at how can you send signals to the arts sector in the region that there's going to be more of this kind of stuff and more of these approaches in the future, if that's fair.
Yeah, absolutely. And to a certain extent, that this is what we expect. We expect there to be innovation. We expect people to examine their assumptions. We expect people to work in different ways and engage their community in new and different ways, but not in a very traditional, like, yeah, we decided that now we were going to market it to the people who live north of whatever street. And that's new and different. We've never done it before, but rather truly looking at engagement. So it's going to be an adventure, and I'm looking forward to it.
Do you find, I have a question though, do you find, because a lot of this, it just sounds to me through this conversation, what you're doing, Helen, is you're trying to get all these different arts organizations to collaborate together. And is that a proper assumption or not? before I move to my next question?
I don't think it's about expecting them to collaborate together, but rather building a community where they can support one another. And I think that that's the difference, right? We're not expecting them necessarily to organize things together, but to be open to each other's opinions and insight, to be able to support each other if they're in a pinch, to be able to call each other up and say, this is what I'm facing, what do you think? I think that's the community that we're trying to build versus the you do theater, you guys got to work together to do theater together. I don't think that's where we're trying to go. It's more on building that supportive community where they can rely on each other's perspective, they can rely on each other's ideas, and because there's one of the things that you do where you sort of sit around in a circle and you have to tell them what the problem is you're facing. Then you have to turn your back and listen to everybody else talk about how they would solve your problem. And watching people's brains almost explode as they have to just keep their mouth shut and listen to the way that other people see their issue. Because they want to say, no, but we tried that. No, that's not really what's happening. But really to sit quiet and listen as somebody else talks through this challenge that you're facing and realizing they can draw different things out and have a different way of approaching it, which could work, is really challenging. And it's trying to build right back to what you were saying earlier, building that level of comfort with being uncomfortable. And I think that's what we're trying to build.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. It would be hard to keep your mouth shut when you've heard things that you've tried and it didn't work, but you may not have done it in a way that they're presenting it, right? They might add a perspective to it that you hadn't thought of that could tweak it enough to have it be successful for you.
One of the things I think, Debbie, that characterizes the work that we do, and will certainly is a feature of the program with Helen and her department, is to bring in methodologies and techniques and tools, practical tools that come from outside the arts, come from outside the nonprofit sector sometimes, but which have been well proven through research to be effective. And we found that these are incredibly refreshing for the arts sector, which has become a little bit hermetic, a little bit sealed. It tends to talk to itself, tends to rely on known experts. And I think this is true about other sectors in the nonprofit field as well. And one of the things that counterbalances that sense of discomfort that Helen's talking about is the sense of release that comes from being in touch with new approaches for the first time. Almost everyone who's been in our program says this, and this were completely new to me and really opened my mind up. And there's so much more imagination and creativity in even the treasurer of our organization, the head of the finance committee, than you'd ever have imagined from what they're there to do. But if you can get the techniques right and you can give them the space, they can be tremendously productive and generative in these areas. So I'm always struck by the fact that the brains trust, if you like, which is what Helen, I think, is talking about, can be so extraordinarily rich and resourceful when you wouldn't have expected it. And to me, that's part of this story. This work is applicable across the nonprofit sector. We've done lots of programs outside the arts, and we've also done some wonderful programs that mix arts organizations with other nonprofits in health and human services, in festivals and events and so on. And the mix has always proven to be astonishing because these insights that flow across the organizations, I think, bring back that sense of creativity that in some ways we may feel we've lost over the last many years, and particularly perhaps in the last 2 years. We've tried our best. We've done all sorts of brilliant and clever things. We don't know how we'll sustain them. And to find a sustainable, imaginative new trajectory that will increase our public value as organizations is tough. But the Brains Trust can deliver that. And that's why I think, in part, this sharing work is so valuable.
This has been a fascinating conversation for me anyway. I hope everybody's been enjoying it. And I've learned so much. I do have a question from Janet. She said it's a really interesting discussion. Will the slides be available after? Richard, that's up to you. I could send her your email address if you like.
No, I would be very happy, Debbie, if it's okay with you. to make a PDF of these slides, send them to you, and have you send them round to everybody. It seems to me that's the best way to go. You can share my email address as well. And if people have questions, of course, I'm always very happy, as I know Helen is, to take feedback and more questions, because, you know, we're just at the top of the iceberg of this work as we speak about it today. And the depth of possibility and of richness is miraculous to discover as you move forward. So if you work in the arts in the region, I encourage you to press Helen for when her program will be announced and be part of that. If you're in other nonprofit fields, talk to each other about a similar program. And I think if you work for a for-profit agency, I hope you find some of the things we've been talking about and the ways to find a competitive new way forward really relevant. So do give us your thoughts afterwards, and I'll send the slides around.
Wonderful. Thanks, Richard. This is pretty much wrapping up our time. If there are no other burning questions or comments or insights, there's a couple of things that have come in on chat. Thanks for some very useful and informative information today. That was from Dave. Rob said thank you. Kyle said so many incredible takeaways from today. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. I thank you, Helen, for making this happen and accepting my invitation. And Richard, thank you for being here with us. That's all I have right now. And thank you so much for joining us for Tuesday Talks with FEO. We're on again next week with, I can't remember who, so I'm sorry, but I'll get that out to you. And this has been a real joy. Thanks so much, Richard and Helen. And with that, we'll sign off and hope to be in touch with you and keep in touch with you both. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting us.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.